Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Brown Bag. My name is Stephen McLeod. I'm the Director of Library Programs, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Wanted to give you a heads up on a few library programs that we've got coming up soon. We're going to be hosting our next Brown Bag on October 31, and that's with Mount Vernon's Associate Curator, Amanda Isaac, and our historic costumer, Catherine Bright Brown. And they're going to present on the study and reproduction of 18th century garments, and looking specifically at a number of items, garments that were worn by Martha Washington. On November 1 and 2, we're going to be hosting our annual George Washington Symposium, which this year is entitled Founding Fellows, 10 Years of Academic Excellence. And this particular program will feature the scholarship of all former fellows from our fellowship program. And then our next lunch at the library is going to take place on November 6th with a former fellow by the name of Alan Pell Crawford and his new book, This Fierce People, The Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South. And now to introduce today's guest speaker. Matthieu Haroux is a history teacher living near Paris, France. He's also a French PhD candidate at the University of Paris 1, Pantheon-Sorbonne, where he is working on Rochambeau, or the culture for the military service of the state, 1725 to 1807. Here at Mount Vernon, Matthieu is working on the American segment of the Rochambeau story. He's focusing on the general's relationships with Lafayette, George Washington, and Chateauneuf, among others. And he's also analyzing the operational and tactical aspects of the war. Matthieu is the recipient of Mount Vernon's James C. Reese Fellowship on the Leadership of George Washington, and he joins us today to discuss his research topic, Rochambeau and the American War for Independence, 1780 to 1783. So please join me in welcoming Matthieu Haroux.
Thank you, everyone. First, I would like to thank you, Mount Vernon George Washington Presidential Library, which gave me privilege to conduct my research here on Rochambeau and the American Revolution War, which gave me such a magnificent and quiet place to write my biography about Rochambeau and gave the opportunity to visit different places on the East Coast, Boston, Philadelphia, Yorktown, where I met the American friends of Lafayette and its incredible President Chuck. I visited also Williamsburg too. I was able to visit the University of Yale and its fabulous Beinecke building, to visit the Library of Congress and the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. Thank you for all to them, their patience and sympathy and their professionalism. And since it is the end of a cycle, I would like to give a special thanks to Stephen, Samantha, Eliana, Megan, Kenneth, Mady, Katie, Maureen, Dab, the fellows, and all that I didn't mention. And the last but not least, my friend, Iris de Rode. Everything is it's okay? Okay. So today, I would like to share the results of my research conducted here in Mount Vernon, but also at Yale and Library of Congress on Jean-Baptiste de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, during the American Revolution War. People associate him to the end of the war as one of the great men who engaged the British and defeated Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1780, turning point of the war. His name echoes as well at Mount Vernon because of the visit he visited George Washington during the march of the army to the south. You can also find a sign on the road 200 meters from here. He has his statue in front of the White House in Lafayette Square. His name appears when you drive the night. But his life is quite unknown, mostly in France, where everybody knows Lafayette, but not Rochambeau. Just a few people know him because of this statue and my friend, of course, and family who I've been annoying every day for around 6 years. It is also difficult to say what he looks like. Certainly not that portrait. You can, oh, that portrait. You could see in Versailles, even if I can resist to take a picture of everything I go. This painting is nearby the Galerie des Batailles, where you could see another famous painting. This is the Galerie des Batailles. During that brand bag, I will focus on the fellowship, the relationship between Rochambeau, Washington, and the other protagonists of the American Independence War. But first, I would like to introduce Rochambeau and tell you about his career before America. I'm gonna take the time. Okay. So, who is Rochambeau? Jean-Baptiste was born, it's a few minutes, was born in Vendôme, France in 1725. Vendôme is localized south of Paris, near Loire, in a noble family. The official genealogy insists on his ancestors who participated to the First Crusade. During the 17th century, they had ties with the court of Versailles, but they didn't have enough power to influence the king at Versailles, Louis XV. Since the Jean-Baptiste father had an handicap, he had no choice but to buy charges and honors like captain of the castle of Vendôme, already ruined. Then, in the beginning of the 18th century, the Rochambeau's parents built a strategy to raise their family. They made in order the Rochambeau's paper, and they decided that their firstborn gonna be officer of the King of France. Jean-Baptiste would be a priest. You can see some few documents I find in the castle. Yeah. During the Jean-Baptiste studied in Vendôme and then Blois, but when he was 12, his brother died. Jean-Baptiste replaced him as the new heir. He returned to Vendôme and completed his education. Mathematics, Latin, history, French, geography, but also fencing. He went to Paris when he integrated an academy of cavalry. In 1741, the War of Austrian Succession began. Between one side, you've got, this is Blois, you can say it is, and in Vendôme. So the War of Austrian Successions began between one side, Prussia, France, and Bavaria, and on the other side, Austria, Great Britain, Saxe, and the Netherlands. During that war, Rochambeau arrived in Germany in the beginning of 1742 and improved the Petite Guerre, which means detached troops, wagons, etc. The small war had been practiced in America during the next war. Because of his ability, zeal, and courage, he quickly became aide de camp and then captain of his own company. He finished the war as a colonel. The war wasn't easy for him, and Rochambeau is a perfect example that a French officer could endure during a war, far from the image of the guerre en dentelle. He was close dying twice. He got a high fever, forced him to stay in bed for months, and he was injured by 2 bullets, which nearly killed him. Meanwhile, his mother tried to raise his family, and it was hard because the uncle of Jean-Baptiste was disgraced because of strategical errors at sea. When his mother, Marie-Claire Bégon, went to Versailles, she reactivated all ties and became governess of the children of Orléans, the cadet branch of the Bourbon in the Palais Royal in Paris. This is the Palais Royal at that time. And right now, it is near the Louvre. You can see Palais Royal. When European courts brought back peace to Europe, Rochambeau remained as an active officer. He got married to John Thérèse d'Acosta. He loved deeply. We can find an anecdote here in front with this lovely way to write. I could explain you the anecdote after. In 1758, a new war began, you call French and Indian War. Rochambeau participated in the siege of Minorque, which was English at that time, and could observe for the first time an army-navy combination. You could see the French Navy, the French Army, and maybe, I don't know, Rochambeau. He went to Germany and Flanders, again, because of the Petite Guerre. He thwarted the enemy plans. After the war, Rochambeau criticized the commandment and the heaviness of military movements and maneuvers. During that war, he developed a new kind of troop, the chasseur. In addition to line or column maneuvers, he trained his soldiers to fire on target and paid for their training. He met the Maréchal de Broglie, who became his patron and his protector. At the end of the peace treaty, France was exhausted and lost his or her empire. For 20 years, the country tried to turn the table against England. Meanwhile, Rochambeau had been nominated as a general inspector of the infantry, which means that he carried about discipline, execution of the reforms, and participated in peace camps, Verberie and Vossieux. That later was so important to him, and I would like to explain to you just a few minutes about that camp. During the 18th century, troops needed to improve, perform exercises, simulation, but some officers, including Rochambeau, demand large-scale military exercises. At Vossieux, in September 1778, they gathered soldiers, and it is important to remember the context to understand the meaning of such a gathering of people. I already said that French troops needed to practice, but precisely in 1778, because they had to be prepared to engage the British. Indeed, French signed in 1778 an alliance with the insurgents to help them to fight the British in the north of America. The purpose, to restrict the British global domination and keep their interests safe in the Caribbean area. France had plans, among them an invasion of England, a new plan. That exercise could take place in Normandy, at Vossieux, across the Channel from Great Britain. Secondly, it became necessary to arbitrate a battle between two orders, the line and the columns. There was a discussion between two ways of thinking. For 10 or 20 years, officers, philosophers, physicians had to be talking about it in the saloon or in Versailles. Books had been written, and the king wanted to determine what it was better for the troops. To resume, Broglie, the Maréchal of Broglie, his patron, the patron of Rochambeau, was in favor of the column. Wow. And Guibert was in favor of the line. Rochambeau had been chosen by Broglie himself to be his own contradictor on the battlefield. During the demonstrations, Rochambeau didn't succeed in proving to Broglie wrong, but he showed that we had to use both. That moment had been so important to Rochambeau because his name became associated to the mixed order, but also to discipline and to pragmatism. The next year, in 1779, France wanted to invade England, as I said. They had a new invasion plan, and Rochambeau had to participate as commander of the grenadier troops, the elite troops. The invasion failed, you can imagine, but Versailles decided to send troops to America when just Rochambeau decided to expand his castle. It is the castle of Rochambeau, and he built two new wings aside the old castle. So, Rochambeau, Washington, and the others. On May the 2nd, 1780, a 30-ship convoy left Brest in West France. On board, 5,500 soldiers under command of Rochambeau, recently promoted as Lieutenant General of the King. The French troops are escorted by 7 ships of line of the Admiral Ternay. After more than 70 days at sea, Rochambeau landed at Newport, Rhode Island, on July 11th. Contacts were therefore quickly established with the population and local authorities, and letters were sent to Washington, which was camped in front of New York. A correspondence also began with General Lafayette, La Luzerne, representative of France to the Congress, and the Congress. Washington and Lafayette urged Rochambeau to attack New York, held by Clinton and the British Navy. What will be the decision? First, Versailles anticipated the extreme stretching of the lines of communication by allowing the existence of a single American command, but it also needed on the spot of educated, zealous officer with a solid military reputation, an educated leader who had a military reputation who, totally in the principle of the day, could please a crowd of young, exalted people who wanted to serve in this war, Rochambeau. The choice fell on Rochambeau, whose commitment during the Seven War is called in his instructions. According to Versailles, it was a question of undertaking everything for the salvation of America. But those means must not be sacrificed either lightly or recklessly. When he learned that the expeditionary force would only amount to 4,000 men, Rochambeau pursued the king to increase that number by first recalling that he had lost. During previous wars, 2/3 of the troops which were under his command, and adding 2 examples of external operations carrying out in the past. Rochambeau finally obtained an increase of troops to 5,500 men. Concerning resources, here again, the commander succeeded in inflating the number of artillery pieces. Fortunately, because Washington will have difficulty to maintain his troops in sufficient number. Secondly, it is important to know that before his departure, Rochambeau received instructions which clarified the commandment in America, translated and sent to Washington to be transparent. As you can see here, it is the translation. The Ministry of War insists Washington must obey Rochambeau, must obey Washington. The French are auxiliaries of the American army, and the relations with Washington must be good. It is an obligation. It is crucial. But in spite of these considerations, the relationships between Washington and Rochambeau began with difficulties. Indeed, Washington hurried the French to attack directly New York, the center of the British organization, and he sent Lafayette. The latter insists on Rochambeau, but the French commandment refused. His troops were sick, weak after 70 days at sea, unprepared to go through the American territory. Rochambeau waited for a second division promised by Versailles and more money. Washington accepted quickly, but not Lafayette, who overacted. Fortunately, the old French officer showed the words to make peace. They need to trust each other. To succeed, cooperation and reciprocity could help. Rochambeau had to deal with Washington, but also with the other protagonists, as you can see here. It is in French, but it's a little bit transparent, so you can maybe understand. You've got the American at the left side with the Congress and Washington, and the left side you've got the French. Among these actors, you can find the Navy, which keep its independence, contrary to Rochambeau, but they had to help the insurgents in all manner they could. Admiral Ternay, who escorted Rochambeau, was pessimistic and didn't think that French could do anything in America. The communications between the protagonists could be difficult because of the different use and manners, different culture, different way of life, and different language. It could make an inability or a failure to understand. So Rochambeau chose aides de camp who spoke English, Châteauneuf, for example. And a thing that I discover here, it is that the translation of the Washington's letters was translated by Rochambeau himself. On the left side, it is the Rochambeau. He couldn't speak English, but I think that it was his secretary who speak English. Despite these precautions, the communications were not easy and cost. Rochambeau organized a hussars line and used the frigate system. The letters were written in double, triple, even more, 11. Another difficulty consisted in the ignorance of the country. Before departing, Rochambeau met Lafayette to speak about the terrain, and the French general asked for an atlas bought in Philadelphia. He needed to be prepared to every situation, so he insists for more cavalry, more artillery of siege, a new system, the Gribeauval system, and read the Franklin scheme. Rochambeau knew his total ignorance and anticipated surprises, asking the minister, what would happen if American people suddenly refused their help? Rochambeau surrounds himself with aides de camp chosen according to their skills. As I said, in addition to his mastery of English, Second Lieutenant Dumas was an excellent draftsman, and he had his famous military eye. It is their responsibility to be the eyes and the ears of the general. During the campaign, Rochambeau assigned each of his aides de camp a very specific role. Under the pretext of visiting Philadelphia or Boston, as I did too, they needed to establish reconnaissance. They were particularly the case of Châteauneuf, who wrote the story his journey from Newport to Philadelphia. Some operations also offered additional reconnaissance for the future. In August 1780, because of this situation that I explained, when Washington urged to attack New York, Rochambeau preferred to procrastinate and gather strength while waiting for winter and the arrival of a second division, which would not take long. As he said, the French established a defensive camp at Newport by relieving the English redoubts and building new ones. You can see the ships, the fleet, and the old and new redoubts surrounding the camp. Convinced that the fortifications operations had demonstrated their effectiveness after an English fleet had given up on engaging in combat, Rochambeau was able to reassure Washington, the enemy is doing what it must do, but fortunately a little late. During the campaign, Rochambeau and Washington were separated by miles. On September 20, Rochambeau and Washington met for the very first time at Hartford, where a conference took place. By the time it was necessary to dissipate the misunderstanding, Rochambeau and the French admiral was accompanied by Fersen, the famous Fersen, Châteauroux, Mathieu Dumas, and others. Washington brought with him Knox, Lafayette, and Gouvion. Like I said, they wanted to engage the British directly in New York with the naval superiority. They decided to attack New York for the following spring, 81, but under certain conditions, having constant naval superiority and receiving land reinforcements and additional money. Money is very important in that war. And French money too. In the meantime, the French army will enter its winter quarters. During that conference, they also decided to send Rochambeau's son to Versailles to understand what had happened, because nobody had news from France since the departure. After that conference, the situation went badly during winter. Money began to run out, and mutinies broke out among Washington's troops. Most of all because the American government was not quite well organized, and the American army composed by composite members, militiamen, and Continental Army. They were not paid because the Congress was under financial stress and leading the war. At that time, Benedict Arnold, a trusted officer of the general-in-chief who betrayed Washington, operated in Virginia, where General Cornwallis was also located. In February, the French commandant accepted to attack against Arnold in South. This expedition is interesting because the French Navy responded to a Virginia's and Congress demand with the acceptance of Rochambeau, who wanted to join soldiers from the army. Washington had been advised when ships were gone. Like Rochambeau, he encouraged a bigger expedition, too late. The second expedition in South would be more prepared, but once again, Washington had been taken by surprise, even if he went to Newport to observe the boarding. Washington did succeed in changing the French plan, constituted in a few ships of line and men under command of Lafayette and Vieux-Ménil. The operation failed. Lafayette was still sent by Washington to continue the fight against Arnold. The Marquis continually harassed him, leading Clinton to urgently send reinforcements from New York. Washington was upset and wrote to his cousin an unfair letter about it, because his letter arrived after the preparation of the South operations. Anyway, that letter created a misunderstanding because it had been published in the British press. Thanks to the personality of both commandants, they avoided to break up. But as you can see, these operations reveal the limits of a single commandment. Another example, in April, the French army and Washington agreed that Navy and armies will wage together when French Navy disagreed because of their orders from Versailles, which says to go to Boston. Finally, Washington and Rochambeau pursued the Navy to stay at Newport. And talking about Versailles, What about Versailles? One of the most important actors on that campaign. Whether only through the financing of the war or the human and logistical support, Versailles largely contributes to the decisive victories of the Chesapeake and Yorktown. But, no, sorry. Due to its geographical distance, it is nevertheless necessary to question the real influence of certain decisions taken by the court and their impact on Washington and Rochambeau. Despite these tools and reasonable autonomy, Rochambeau complained of only receiving the first dispatches from the court in February 1781, with among the letters those dating from May of the previous year. What criticism does he make? At first glance, one might think that the French general is criticizing Versailles for the absence of an order or a precise campaign plan. But the reality has to be nuanced. Thanks to their systematic analysis, we discovered that the French general didn't blame directly the authorities of Versailles for the lack of order or campaign plan. Washington's initial idea of attacking New York was also that of the court of the French commander refused. It wasn't, sorry, I lose the way. Yes. In fact, until the spring of 1781, Rochambeau mainly waiting for money and the arrival of a second division promised by the king. He even established reconnaissance to establish these future districts. Every time a sail appears on the horizon, hope raised, followed by disappointment. Little by little, uneasiness set in between the French general and the court, and he felt disowned. And he wrote that later. I can't translate you, but he's completely disappointed. He feels very bad. He's very alone at that time. If we took at the other side of the Atlantic, several factors explain the lack of response in Versailles. Until the winter of 1780, the ministers didn't receive any letters from Rochambeau because his first letters failed to reach France, either due to a shipwreck, a gale of wind, misrouting, or interceptions by enemies. I try to explain the difficulties for sending such letters and to understand the time they had to go across the ocean. For example, you've got here the yellow one will be received only in, you can see, at that time. And the blue one at that time. And the violet one at that time. Okay. It was only when the Lieutenant General decided to send his own son, Donatien, to the court of Louis XVI. Sorry, it is not Louis XVI. It is his mother-in-law. It was only when, to the court of Versailles after the Hartford Conference in September 1780 that official news of the expeditionary force crossed the Atlantic. The ministers then immediately took up their pens to announce the sending of money. Versailles was therefore waiting for news from Rochambeau to write to him. In one of the responses received by the frigate L'Astrée in February 28, The minister, donc it is that one. The minister explained that the object contained in the results of the Hartford Conference appeared to His Majesty too great importance so that they can be treated lightly. In short, Versailles asked Rochambeau for additional reflection time because, in fact, the situation at court was delicate. In a few weeks, the ministers of war and navy were replaced. And then there was the death, here we are, of the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, died. And of course, that the course of politics at Versailles was therefore considerably disrupted. Learning that news, Rochambeau understood the slow reactions because he knew the ministries of power perfectly. He even reassured Washington about the qualities of the new Minister of the Navy. However, this didn't prevent the King's Lieutenant General from complaining and fearing for his troops because he knew from experience that distance and separation from love could cause an overall decline in morale and discipline. These complaints, however, didn't constitute the bulk of the letters. Over the months, and despite a certain excitement, where we observed an active correspondence established on both sides of the ocean, which show that the links were never broken. You can see all the letters Rochambeau sent to Versailles in green. Rochambeau receiving 32 letters from the court between the months of July 80 and December 21, himself sending 40. In the exchanges, we sense a French commander who was both conscious, free to combine and operate on American territory, but also worried and anxious to obtain a decisive victory on American soil. The gaze of the French continued to regularly turn towards Versailles, from where decisive news would soon arrive. And it is the final push of the war. In the first month of 1781, the replacement of the ministers of war and navy didn't immediately appear to bring any major change. The French stations at Newport had to be contained to wait for official directives, their general acting as intermediary between the court and Washington. In spring, however, things began to clear up. Versailles realized that it was necessary to redouble their efforts and wage a peripheral war wherever the English were likely to be present. The objective was to wage, as soon as possible, a war of attrition by establishing maritime superiority each time they could in the West Indies and North America. Admiral de... Again. Sorry, I have to... Okay. Okay. Admiral de Grasse received the commandment of a powerful squadron made up of 20 ships and 3 frigates to come and anchor in American waters. Rochambeau received the news of the imminent arrival of the naval army, which is currently under sail to join America. News which reached the camp on May the 8th by the frigate La Concorde. At that time, morale was then at its lowest. That later changed everything and convinced the French Lieutenant General to meet Washington on May 21 at Wethersfield. During this second conference, several options were being considered. The first consists of attacking in the South territory where Lafayette was already operating against Arnold and Cornwallis fortified at Yorktown. This was Rochambeau's will. The other option was to march on New York in accordance with Washington's wish. They also considered Boston or Charlestown. Nothing was decided, the decision being postponed until after the meeting of the Allied forces in front of New York, which was set for the following July. I'm gonna find the right. Okay. In accordance with official directive, Rochambeau said nothing about it to Washington. He barely mentioned the case of the arrival in these areas of the West Indies squadron, which will probably be announced by a frigate. Since the choice was not made between New York and the Chesapeake, he wrote to de Grasse to convince him to come and to operate in Virginia. In his letter, he explained the situation of the South. In fact, the choice of the Chesapeake was seriously considered as nearly as April by the Chevalier de la Luzerne, Châteauroux. Contrary to ministerial directions, Washington was also informed a few days before the conference of the de Grasse arrival. He nevertheless persists in believing that an attack on New York is possible. The audacious plan for a combined operation is therefore taking shape little by little in the mind of the French commandant, but everything also depends on the de Grasse. Where did he want to go in North America? It is the map. The French, so you can say you got the grass in the Caribbean area, but we can't say where he want to go. Where did he want to go in North America? The French stationed in Rhode Island for a year were hard-pressed to guess, and even if he chose Virginia, other Christians would remain. What would happen if the English had the capacity to block Barras' squadron in Newport? You could find Barras here, and he had the artillery of siege. Very, very important. So you got 3 points. You've got Barras, you've got Rochambeau, and you've got de Grasse. Could a climatic hazard such as an early hurricane disperse de Grasse fleet? How to ensure the defense of St. Domingo? And above all, it remains to convince the general-in-chief of the Franco-American army to give up New York because the decision is his. Finally, a letter from Admiral de Grasse announced his choice, the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. This place, he said, this place which seems indicated to me by you, Monsieur le Comte of Rochambeau, and Monsieur Washington, de la Luzerne, de Barras, as the safest to achieve the good that you propose. This choice, known on August 50, so you do remember the letters of Rochambeau was in May 28, and received the letters is in August 15. So this choice immediately led Washington to abandon the idea of the siege of New York, which led to the victorious march to Yorktown. Meanwhile, the French fleet succeeded in blocking off the British army, as you can see there, and looking up Cornwallis in Yorktown. After their meeting in front of New York, the French and American army descended south and began the siege of Yorktown on September 28. The operations ended with the British capitulation on October 19. The French army spent the winter, after Yorktown, the French army spent the winter in Virginia, and the generals were already thinking about future projects. The naval disaster at Les Saints in Caraïbes, however, precipitated things, and the expeditionary force dispersed at the end of 1782. To conclude, barely disembarked in July 1780, Rochambeau wrote to the minister, "We have had received any failure either by land or by sea, and I dare say, sir, that this is all that we could hope with such an advanced pawn." Finally, during the campaign of 1781, like in chess, each pawn had to be used strategically and with patience in order to save unnecessary losses and win the final decision. Thank you for your attention. And I am open to short questions because, as you can say, my English is not perfect. And yes, you've got, we organized a symposium in June 76, 77 or 77, 78. We have to decide it. So, yes.
You talked about Rochambeau's military experience. Yeah, you talked about Rochambeau's military experience in Europe. Where do you think he got the diplomatic understanding to be able to negotiate with Washington and navigate the French bureaucracy? Did he develop that in America, or did he have any background or any qualities that he brought with him?
Actually, thank you for the question. Actually, he learned on the terrain of the battlefield, and because he was aide de camp of Orleans family and also of the Maréchal of France, so he deal with them. But I think that it was during, I'm just looking for the moment, yes. That moment of Vautier was so important because he was under the tent of the French commandant, and he had to explain why it is impossible to choose between the lines and the columns. So he needs to persuade them that it is there is no need to shoot just one thing. And this kind of discussions, at that time we could have that kind of discussion at the Cour of Versailles or in the Salon, and you need to talk very well. You have to explain, you have to convince, it is a battle of words. And I'm sure that he improved it during the Vautier's camp, because after that camp, I explained that the question of line and columns was, and I've written A and on end, sorry. There was a battle, but also a battle of books, and each participant wrote a new book about that moment, that Vautier camp. And as you can see here, you've got a book from Guibert, who was against the columns, but not. He was in favor of the lines, and he changed his mind about the columns after the camp of Vautier. He said exactly what Rochambeau explained under the tent. So it is diplomatic.
Matthieu, when you hear the list of difficulties, language barrier, delay in communication, it's amazing that anything got done. incompetence of the U.S. Congress. What could you briefly summarize the keys to victory at Yorktown? Obviously, luck plays an important role in any engagement like this, but there is de Grasse. There is talk about how they managed to pull this off.
I think that is patience. We need to be patient to know that communication is going to be tough, very tough. And you need trust between each other. And when Rochambeau sent the letter to Washington to De Grasse in May, he explained the reason why he had to engage the British in Yorktown, but he didn't say go there. He just suggested. It is always like that because he knew that he was under command of Washington, and Washington had to give the orders. So I think it is the key of that is to be patient, stay, wait, and see. And I think it is the key. And everybody, every protagonist is talked at that time of miracle of Yorktown, because when you see the map on that, every pawns was in favor of the victory, but everything could happen. We don't know. A new fleet from the British, a new squadron from New York, De Grasse, who came from could be embarrassed by a hurricane. So it is very complicated, and you have to let the door open to every situation. Because when they decided to go to South, they had already the idea of going to Yorktown because Barras had the artillery of siege. And since he had that artillery on board, Rochambeau knew that it wasn't impossible. It wasn't possible to engage directly New York. It could be just Yorktown. It wasn't another place. Maybe Charlestown, but at that time it was impossible to.
So speaking to the movement of both Rochambeau and Washington to Yorktown, it seems to me historically there was a lot of efforts to keep the British and Clinton thinking that there was going to be a prolonged attack and siege against New York, which means, and I think we've read, my coworker and I have read some of the documentation down at the, some of the original letters that George Washington was writing that are at the University of Virginia that was ordering Lafayette to hold the British forces down there. But he didn't tell them that he was coming there. So I think it was very much a surprise that both Washington and Rochambeau actually moved all the way down there. So there's some aspects of trying to, perhaps through the use of espionage, to keep British forces fixated on a bigger prize up in New York. So it seems to me that Rochambeau is possibly the only person who would have known what those tactics were, like the only witting ally as to that clandestine movement down to Yorktown. Is there anything you could speak to that?
So your question is Rochambeau was the only person to be pursued that
Well,
succeed?
by virtue of him partnering or being with Washington that whole time, in your studies of Rochambeau's own writings, is there anything to indicate some of the tactics they were using to, I guess, misdirect that there was still going to be a prolonged attack in New York while they were moving covertly or clandestinely down to Yorktown?
Well, I think was Rochambeau was surrounded by a lot of people who are just explain the situation, and when I went to Williamsburg, I visited his house in Williamsburg, and also the Châteauroux and Washington. And Washington was together in the same house. So they talked together, but there was that moment of misunderstanding between Châteauroux and Rochambeau when they wanted to pursue Washington to attack Yorktown. It's tough to explain that, but he wrote wrong letters about an attack on New York, and to pursue Washington, and that later was published by the British. So Washington knew, when he knew that, certainly he decided to not attack directly New York. But it is so complicated because in his memories, Rochambeau talk about disappointment against Châteauroux. So I think that there is a very big misunderstanding between Châteauroux, Rochambeau, Washington at that moment, at that time. So it is very difficult to understand the meaning of that correspondence. I hope I respond to your question.
I liked your emphasis on patience, but patient was asking a lot of the soldiers, as you noted, right, that the morale is low. Everywhere, Washington's having problems holding an army together. So this has got to be the tension, right, is how long can we wait for the perfect moment? Will we still have an army left at that moment to do anything with our perfect moment, right? Is that part of the calculation that is going on amongst the top people?
Yeah, I'm just talking about the commanders, but I'm thinking about the soldiers and the camp and the discipline and the sense of honor the officers had, and there is some important things to know about engage the battle, and you can't engage it during the winter when you are European officer. I know the Valais Forge moment, but it was a tough moment. And when you are European, you have to keep your soldiers under your command and make sure that they made exercises and new. They made some parades. And they didn't have right to meet the American people too. They were separate in two different camps. So yes, for the generals, it's important to take the right moment and to keep his soldiers ready for that kind of engagement. But it's one of the point of my my proposal, and there is a lot to say about it. Exercises, discipline, avoid the desertions, and it is complicated. And it was just 5,000 soldiers, and it wasn't a big number, as we can imagine in Europe with 60,000 soldiers for just one army. So
Any other questions? Okay, let's have a round of applause for Matthieu.
thank you. And you can say the leader. You